Le Sacre du Printemps, The Rite of Spring, is a seminal work. Igor Stravinsky's ballet music, even more frequently performed in the concert hall, is one of the most revolutionary orchestral works of the 20th century. Its staggering radicalism hit the musical world like a bombshell.
I think for most people, definitively starts the music of the 20th century. It's the first work that seems completely to turn its back on tradition and to inaugurate something completely new.
After the ballet's first night on the 29th of May 1913 at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, the musical world was never to be the same again. It was danced by the Ballet Russe, Sergei Diaghilev's legendary company that had already premiered Stravinsky's Firebird and Petrushka. The choreography was by the great ballet dancer Václav Nijinsky. The first night audience at the newly opened theatre was largely made up of representatives of Parisian high society, plus a number of bohemians and friends of Diaghilev's. A social event par excellence.
The fashionable Parisian public, who were tremendous fans of the Russian ballet, but they'd grown used to a kind of ballet from Diaghilev, which was like the Firebird. It was a sort of fabulously glittering occasion with marvelously accomplished scenery and dancing and fabulously beautiful music. I mean, they hadn't paid good money to come and see a whole lot of people in pretending to be prehistoric human beings doing very awkward kind of choreography which was completely unlike classical dancing.
The unexpected novelty of the music and the choreography unleashed one of the greatest artistic scandals of the 20th century. Here's writer Jean Cocteau's eyewitness account.
At the first performance of the rite, the audience played the role it was predestined to play. It was in a state of revolt from the outset. People laughed, jeered, whistled, imitated animal noises. Perhaps they would have ultimately tired of all of this if in their exaggerated zeal the progressives and a few musicians had not started insulting and even physically attacking the catcallers. The tumult degenerated into a free-for-all.
In her review, the journalist Valentine Gross wrote, "It was as if an earthquake had hit the theatre. The whole place was reeling. People hurled insults at one another, booed and whistled, completely drowning out the music. There were even outright fistfights." Diaghilev instructed conductor Pierre Monteux to carry on right to the bitter end. The noise was so deafening that the dancers could no longer hear the music, and Nijinsky had to give them their entries from the wings. Next day, the police reported that, fortunately, only 27 people had suffered slight injuries. The response to the premiere was divided. Opponents regarded it as a slap in the face for music in general. Supporters saw it as the dawn of a new era. 6 days after the event, composer and critic Florent Schmitt wrote,
"I believe that Igor Stravinsky is the Messiah we have all been waiting for since Wagner. The man for whom Mussorgsky and Claude Debussy, Richard Strauss and Arnold Schönberg have paved the way."
For Stravinsky, the scandal triggered by the first performance was a traumatic experience. This and the later success of the Rite in the concert hall may be the main reasons why he preferred concert renderings to stage productions of the work. The action of the ballet is in itself very different from what was customary at the time. In a manuscript, Stravinsky noted,
"The Rite of Spring is a musical and choreographic work. It assembles scenes from pagan Russia, held together by one central idea, the mysterious burgeoning of the elemental creative forces of spring."
The music that Stravinsky wrote for this, I think that he had in mind creating a sort of prehistoric music with a huge modern orchestra, of course, and that he turned to the most ancient music that he could find, the music of age-old folk music that had been handed down through an oral tradition and was as ancient as anybody could tell, really. But this was embedded in a completely modern approach to certain musical materials, particularly rhythm and also harmony.
The first part of the rite, the introduction, begins with a solo bassoon evoking the awakening of nature on a spring morning.
The first melody in the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky always admitted was in fact a folk song that came from this collection of Lithuanian folk songs. The original folk song in the collection sounds like this. And this becomes and so on. The bassoon solo at the very beginning of the Rite of Spring.
Here already we see how Stravinsky breaks with traditional techniques of composition. First, he sets the bassoon melody in an unusually high register.
This is a characteristic of the Rite, that Stravinsky uses instruments in ways that are almost against their nature. And the sound that comes out is not the mellow, warm sound of the bassoon, but something that's kind of pinched and thin, and if you like, folk-like. It's trying to make the bassoon sound like some ancient instruments. Another aspect of the Rite that we hear in this opening music is the way the bassoon melody combines with another line. This is the horn that comes in with three notes. And if you listen to them together, you can see that the horn part is not an accompaniment to the bassoon, but it's actually an intrusion. In a way, it's starting to subvert the bassoon melody. And so you get Stravinsky straight away at the beginning of the work thinking of different instruments not so much collaborating with each other, but actually working in competition, working in layers that fight against each other.
Stravinsky begins his depiction of the ancient rite without the participation of the strings. Only later do they join in, hesitantly, almost imperceptibly, muted or pizzicato. Then a brief transition takes us into the action proper.
When the curtain rises, the first section is called the Augurs of Spring, and here Stravinsky imagined the steps of the young boys tapping out what he called the rhythm of the spring. And he found this extraordinary chord, which is actually a conjunction of two quite normal harmonies. There's an E-flat 7 chord, and there's a chord of E major. But you put them together, you get this extraordinary dissonance, and then the idea of repeating it. And that's the rhythm of spring.
The way percussive elements dominate without the participation of even one percussion instrument is a striking aspect of this music. It prompted the remark that Stravinsky handled the orchestra as if it were one big percussion section.
When I was writing the final pages of The Firebird in St. Petersburg, I suddenly had this vision, completely unexpectedly as I was preoccupied with other things, of a solemn pagan rite. Sage elders sitting in a circle and watching a young maiden dance herself to death. They were sacrificing her to propitiate the god of spring. That was the idea for the rite of spring.
Stravinsky was often inspired by visual impressions or even visions. The idea for the rite left such an impression on him that he quickly got his friend Nikolai Röhrig, a painter and an expert on ancient Russian rites and folklore, to help him sketch an outline for the ballet.
Now, where did this idea come from? Well, just possibly it came from the poetry of Sergei Gorodetsky, because 3 years earlier Stravinsky had set 2 poems by Gorodetsky, and the same collection, the same volume of poetry from which these 2 came, contains another poem, very striking poem, about a human sacrifice.
The Rite of Spring consists of 2 parts, the adoration of the earth and the sacrifice, day and night. These are subdivided into 14 sections with programmatic titles. The sequence of the dances corresponds to the different parts of the rite. After the prelude, the awakening of nature, youths appear as messengers of spring, accompanied by a wise old woman. Young girls join them for a round dance that soon develops into a series of rival war games. An aged sage appears. He blesses the earth with a kiss, thus sparking off the frenetic dance of the earth. After this, the search begins for a young girl called upon to dance herself to death to restore the power of spring. An impetuous dance honors the chosen one. After the invocation of the ancestors, the climax of the ritual is finally reached, the sacrificial dance. Stravinsky contrasts the first quick dance sections with a choravid, a slow round dance.
The places in the Rite of Spring that I particularly love are those moments of stillness when you know that something is going to happen. And one of them happens in Spring Rounds, where you have this very quiet, and then with the tune. That something terrible is going to happen, and it does. And so on, like that. And this extraordinary kind of snarl that you get in the orchestra. I love that passage. It's very, very cruel. It's very, very nasty. But it is absolutely electrifying, and no matter how often you hear it, you always feel this is a tremendous moment.
subsequent ritual of the rival tribes sets out different groups of motifs engaging in a kind of contest with one another.
From that basis, Stravinsky builds up this great sort of turbine of sound with all sorts of competing ostinati which are working against each other in layers, and they're in different kind of meters. And there's an extraordinary moment where this suddenly bursts into a fortissimo, and you have the sense of the whole machine suddenly starting to work together. And very typically, again, of the right, there's this huge noise, and it just stops dead. And you get this quivering silence, if you like, after this deafening noise. And then this is the moment, the most solemn moment of part one, when the wise elder, who's now arrived, stoops and blesses the earth by kissing it. And you get, from the huge orchestra playing fortissimo, you come now just a few instruments, the bassoons, the double basses and the timpani, and this sort of weird noise. And then a kind of glassy chord on the string harmonics, which must be the moment, I suppose, when the wise elder actually kisses the earth. The Dance of the Earth is the final dance of the first part, and obviously the climax. And this Stravinsky imagined as being like a kind of prairie fire. If you're standing in the middle of a grass field and there are fires starting up, fanned by the wind, breaking out all around you, and there's a kind of terror about it.
Igor Fyodorovich Stravinsky was born in June 1882 in Oranienbaum near St. Petersburg, where he grew up with his three brothers. His father, Fyodor, was one of the most popular basses of the day and a permanent member of the opera company of the Mariinsky Theatre. His mother played the piano and was also an ardent music lover. Initially, however, Igor was sent to the University of St. Petersburg to study law. It was only later that his musical gifts came to full fruition. A decisive figure in this turn of events was Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, whom he first met in 1902. Rimsky-Korsakov gave him musical tuition over the next 5 years, and the famous Russian composer became a kind of father figure for the young Stravinsky.
But when Rimsky died in 1908, in June 1908, this was just the time when Stravinsky himself was beginning to break out as a composer, beginning to start to find his own voice. And in particular, there were these two orchestral works, one the Scherzo Fantastique, the other a very short piece called Fireworks. And it was the former of these two that Diaghilev heard and impressed him that here was a young man with talent.
Sergei Diaghilev heard this work at a concert in St. Petersburg in February 1909 and immediately sought the young composer's acquaintance. A momentous encounter indeed. The enthusiastic impresario had just taken Paris by storm with his ballet russe. At the Théâtre du Châtelet, the company and their director were idolized by their audiences. In Paris, Diaghilev was the moving spirit of the artistic avant-garde, constantly in search of new inspiration. Unable to find an established composer to provide the music for his Firebird project, he turned to Stravinsky.
And so Diaghilev took the incredibly bold step of approaching this virtually unknown and certainly untried composer, Igor Stravinsky, and giving him the responsibility of writing the music for this new, completely integrated ballet that was going to be the first of its kind to be presented to the Parisian public. Now, Diaghilev gave Stravinsky the job of taking Paris by storm, And he did. It's one of the great miracles of 20th century music.
At the time, Paris was the cultural capital of Europe. Through Diaghilev, Stravinsky met not only famous dancers like Václav Nijinsky, but also painters like Picasso and composers like Debussy. The Firebird was a great success, but the stir caused by the first performance of The Rite made the 30-year-old Stravinsky famous and notorious overnight. The reputation as an enfant terrible dogged him for the rest of his life. The second part begins with an abrupt change of mood. It's night. After the preceding daytime games, all the subsequent events and the mysterious ceremonies that go with them are geared to the ultimate consummation of the sacrifice.
And then you get the curtain going up, and you get the tune for the girls and their circling dance. This is really the one time in The Rite of Spring that Stravinsky uses stringed instruments in a cantabile way, but it's a very, very odd sound indeed. This is played by 6 solo violas, playing quite high up in their range.
The mystic round of the girls serves one purpose only, the choice of the sacrificial victim.
And suddenly there's this sort of shriek as the orchestra kind of scatters, and we can imagine the girls on stage scattering as well, leaving one of their numbers standing in the center motionless. And then you get this extraordinarily primitive noise, these great chords battered out, 11 of them in a bar. And the purpose of those is to drum a kind of pulse into our minds, because then we get one of the wildest dances in The Rite, and we can imagine that the girls are now dancing around the victim who stands motionless in the middle, and they're celebrating her.
The invocation of the ancestors takes the form of an extended fanfare.
The next dance is called the ritual action of the ancestors. And it's actually a moment when a lot of the ideas, a lot of the cross currents within The Rite of Spring, they come together. You have it all embedded in one of these very repetitive, mesmerizing, hypnotic rhythms. And from that, Stravinsky builds up a chord of E flat minor with a 7th and a 9th. It's the same chord he's used earlier in Spring Rounds in the middle of part 1. Here he is using it again.
But the monotonous rhythm is only the lull before the storm. It leads directly to the supreme climax of the rite, the barbaric sacrificial dance.
The famous thing about the sacrificial dance is the rhythmic innovation, where each bar is of a different length, the time signature changes constantly.
Stravinsky drives his method of varying, combining and sequencing tiny motif elements to such lengths as to utterly exhaust the musical material, thus reflecting the exhaustion of the sacrificial victim as she dances herself to death.
The result is a score that looks very, very complicated indeed, with this constant change of meter. And it was absolutely revolutionary for the musicians at the time, and orchestras were simply paralyzed by this. They just didn't know how to play it.
Revolutionary the Rite of Spring certainly is, yet there are links to other artistic currents of the day. Alongside the influence of Stravinsky's teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov, we can also identify composers like Bartók or Prokofiev, who at the same time were using folk elements or emphasizing percussive and rhythmic elements in music. Contact with French composers like Debussy also left an impact on Stravinsky. However, French-style impressionism was never an option for the Russian composer, whose Rite of Spring is the fruit of a much more radical approach that Debussy was unable or unwilling to emulate. In a letter to Stravinsky, he says,
"The rite haunts me like a fearsomely beautiful nightmare, a terrifying impression I find impossible to restore, try as I may."
In 1962, Stravinsky himself recorded the genesis of the work.
I was not guided by a system of any kind. I only had my ear to help me. I heard and wrote down what I heard. I was the vessel through which the rite passed.
I think the most amazing thing about the effect of the Rite of Spring is that it remains, after all these years, nearly 100 years, still as exciting every time you hear it. I think it stands out from almost everything in the Western tradition. It is a really, really frightening piece of music, and it goes on being frightening.